Do you believe you know the person you've been sleeping in the same bed with for 10 years? Helen believed it too, until she discovered that her perfect marriage was just a carefully constructed lie. What would you do if you found out that the person you love most in the world used you as a disguise for an entire decade? Today, you're going to hear the story of a woman who had the courage to face the most painful truth of her life. How many times have you looked at your partner and wondered if you really know them? How many times have you had that strange feeling that something wasn't right, but chose to ignore it because the truth might be too painful? Helen lived this reality for 10 long years. Imagine waking up every day next to someone you consider your soulmate, planning the future together, creating memories you believe are real, and discovering that it was all just an act. That the person you trusted most in the world was playing a role, using you as part of a plan you didn't even know existed. The truth is that we often live in illusions we prefer to maintain, because questioning them means accepting that our reality could completely crumble. Helen was one of those people. She had what everyone considered a dream marriage, a structured family, a life that many envied. But beneath this perfect appearance, there was a secret so devastating that it would change everything forever. Helen never imagined that her greatest quality, fully trusting the people she loved, would also be her greatest vulnerability. She never suspected that someone could be capable of maintaining such a cruel lie for so long, until the signs became impossible to ignore. Today, you're going to hear the story of a woman who discovered that sometimes the people we love most are capable of the greatest betrayals. A story that will make you question everything you think you know about relationships, trust, and the masks that people wear. By the way, tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching us from? I'd love to know where you're following our story from. Helen woke up that Friday morning with a smile on her face. In 2 days it would be the big day, her 10th wedding anniversary with Richard. 10 years, an entire decade of love, companionship, and building a life together. She reached her arm to the side of the bed, but found only cold sheets. Richard had already left for work. It wasn't unusual. In recent months, Richard had been leaving earlier and coming home later. New projects, he always said when Helen asked. As an architect, he had always had irregular hours, so Helen never questioned it much. After all, she trusted him completely. Helen got up and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The house was quiet. Amanda, her 8-year-old daughter, was still sleeping. It was in these quiet moments that Helen most appreciated the life they had built. A beautiful house in the suburbs, a solid marriage, a wonderful daughter. It was exactly the life she had always dreamed of having. While the coffee brewed, Helen picked up her notebook. She had a huge list of things to do for the anniversary party. She wanted everything to be perfect. She had hired the same caterer from their wedding, ordered flowers identical to those in the bouquet she carried down the aisle, and even got the DJ to play the same playlist from the reception. It would be a celebration of the most beautiful 10 years of her life. Helen had always been a detail-oriented person. Since childhood, she believed that special things deserved special attention. And what could be more special than celebrating a decade of true love? She wanted Richard to know how much those years meant to her, how much she valued everything they had built together. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Lisa, her best friend since college. "Helen, how are the party preparations going?" Lisa was always straight to the point. "Running around with 1,000 details, but it's looking beautiful." "Richard is going to be surprised," Helen replied, her enthusiasm showing in her voice. "He's lucky to have you." "Not every man has a wife who dedicates herself like that," Lisa commented. "By the way, is he excited about the party?" Helen paused for a second. It was a simple question, but it made her think. In recent days, whenever she mentioned the party, Richard would just smile and say, "It's going to be great, honey." It wasn't exactly lack of enthusiasm, but it also wasn't the excitement she would expect from someone celebrating 10 years of marriage. "Of course he is. You know how he is. More reserved about these things," Helen replied, more to herself than to Lisa. After the call, Helen went to wake up Amanda. The girl was the spitting image of her father, brown hair, green eyes, and that smile that won anyone over. Seeing her always reminded Helen of how blessed she and Richard were to have formed such a beautiful family. During breakfast, Amanda chattered about school, about friends, about the new dress Helen had bought for her to wear to the party. It was comforting to have these normal family moments that reminded Helen of how good her life was. After dropping Amanda off at school, Helen spent the day running around with the final details. She called the caterer, checked the flowers, tested the sound, organized the decorations. Each completed task made her more excited. It would be an unforgettable night. When Richard came home that night, Helen could barely contain her excitement. "Richard, you have no idea how beautiful the party is going to be. I got all those details I told you about and—" "Helen," he interrupted her gently, "that's great, honey. I'm sure it's going to be perfect." There was something in his tone of voice. It wasn't exactly disinterest, but a certain distance. Helen looked at her husband. He seemed tired, more than usual. There were small wrinkles around his eyes that she didn't remember seeing before. "Are you okay?" "You seem worried about something," she asked, gently touching his face. Richard held her hand and smiled. "Just work. You know how it is, but I'm fine. And you? How was your day running around with everything?" It was the answer Helen expected. But even so, something bothered her. She couldn't explain exactly what. Maybe it was just pre-party anxiety. After all, she wanted everything to be perfect, so it was natural to be more sensitive to anything that seemed out of the ordinary. That night, while they were getting ready for bed, Helen looked at Richard in the bathroom mirror. He was brushing his teeth, as he did every night for 10 years. It was such a familiar, common scene that it reassured her. They had a routine, a life built together, shared memories. That's what mattered. But as they lay in bed, Helen noticed that Richard turned to his side faster than usual. Normally, they would talk a little before sleeping, tell each other about their day, make plans. That night, he just murmured, "Good night," and closed his eyes. Helen lay looking at the ceiling for a few minutes, trying to identify what was bothering her. It was as if there was something in the air, a feeling she couldn't name. But she soon pushed those thoughts away. It was just anxiety, she was sure. After the party, everything would go back to normal. What Helen didn't know was that small details, when added up, can reveal truths that change everything forever. And that sometimes, the life we consider perfect can be just a very well-constructed illusion. Have you ever had the feeling that something was wrong, but couldn't identify what? Have you ever felt that the person you love was distant, but preferred to ignore it? Tell us in the comments what your experience was. And if you're enjoying this story, leave a like on the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. Helen's story is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. On Saturday morning, Helen woke up excited. It was the last day of preparations before the big party. Richard wasn't in bed again, but this time she heard the sound of the shower in the bathroom. At least he was home. When Richard came out of the bathroom, Helen noticed he was dressing up more than usual for a Saturday. Dress pants, a well-pressed shirt, even a different cologne than he usually wore. "Are you going out?" Helen asked, trying to sound casual. "I need to take care of some work things. You know how it is, that project I told you about," Richard replied, adjusting his shirt in the mirror. Helen frowned. "But it's Saturday, Richard. And tomorrow is our party. I thought we could spend the day together, maybe help with the final preparations." "Helen, you know I completely trust your good taste. You always organize everything perfectly," he said, giving her a quick kiss on the forehead. "I won't be long." There was something different in the way he spoke, more rushed, less affectionate than usual. Helen stood in the room, listening to the sound of the car leaving the garage. It was strange. In 10 years of marriage, Richard always helped her with important events. It was one of the things she loved most about him, how he got involved in things that were important to her. During the morning, while Amanda watched cartoons in the living room, Helen tried to focus on the preparations. She called the caterer to confirm the time, checked if the drinks were right, organized the decorations, but her mind kept going back to Richard. Why was he so distant lately? It was noon when Richard's phone rang on the coffee table. He had forgotten it at home. Helen looked at the screen. It was a text message from someone named Stephen. She had never heard Richard mention that name. For a moment, Helen hesitated. She was never the type to go through her husband's things. She always believed that trust was the foundation of any relationship. But something inside her was restless. Without thinking much, she picked up the phone. The message said, "Are we still meeting today? I'm excited." Helen felt a chill in her stomach. Who was Stephen, and why was he excited to see Richard? She stared at the message, trying to find an innocent explanation. Maybe it was a new client, or a work colleague, but why use the word excited? When Richard came home in the mid-afternoon, Helen was in the kitchen preparing Amanda's snack. She heard the door slam and called out, "Richard, your phone was here." It rang a few times. She watched his reaction. For a split second, she saw something that looked like concern cross Richard's face before he returned to normal. "Oh, thanks. Must be work," he said, quickly grabbing the phone and checking the messages. "Who is Stephen?" Helen asked, trying to sound uninterested while cutting an apple for Amanda. Richard paused. It was only for a second, but Helen noticed. "Stephen. He's a new client." "Why?" "He sent a message." It seemed important. "It's probably nothing urgent," Richard said, putting the phone in his pocket. "How are the preparations going?" The change of subject was too obvious. Helen had known Richard for 15 years, since they met in college. She knew when he was being evasive, and now he was being evasive. That night, after Amanda went to sleep, Helen tried to start a conversation. "Richard, are you sure everything is okay? You seem distant lately." He was on the couch, working on his laptop. "Distant? How?" "I don't know. You go out more, come home later, seem worried about something, and today, when I asked about Stephen..." "Helen." Richard closed the laptop harder than necessary. "You're being controlling. I have the right to have my professional life without having to explain every detail, don't I?" Helen felt like she had been slapped. In 10 years of marriage, Richard had never spoken to her like that, never called her controlling. "I'm not being controlling. I'm being your wife. I'm worried about you." "You don't need to worry. Everything is fine," he said, already getting up. "I'm going to take a shower." Helen was left alone in the living room, feeling as if the ground had moved beneath her feet. It wasn't just Richard's defensive reaction. It was the whole picture, the mysterious outings, the calls answered in other rooms, the way he changed the subject when she asked questions. For the first time in 10 years, Helen wondered if she really knew the man she was married to. Later, lying in bed next to Richard, who was already sleeping, or pretending to be, Helen looked at the ceiling and tried to organize her thoughts. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe it was just the stress from his work, combined with her anxiety about the party. But a small voice inside her head whispered that something wasn't right. And for the first time in her life, Helen began to question whether her tendency to fully trust people wasn't, in fact, a form of naivety. She looked at Richard sleeping next to her, the same face she had been kissing for 10 years, the same hands that held hers at the altar, the same man who promised to love, honor, and respect until death do them part. So why, suddenly, did he seem like a stranger? The next day would be Helen's dream party. She had planned every detail to celebrate 10 years of what she considered true love. What she didn't know was that sometimes the most beautiful celebrations can reveal the most painful truths. Sunday arrived with a perfect blue sky. Helen woke up early, her heart racing with excitement. It was party day. 10 years of marriage deserved to be celebrated, and she was sure it would be an unforgettable night. Richard was still sleeping when she got up. Helen watched him for a moment, remembering how handsome he was. Even after all these years, she still felt butterflies in her stomach when she looked at him. Last night they had argued, but today was a new day. Today was their day. The morning flew by. Helen checked every detail one last time. The flowers were perfect. The caterer arrived on time. The decoration was exactly as she had imagined. Everything was going as planned. Amanda looked beautiful in her new dress, helping her mother with small tasks and asking questions about who would come to the party. Lisa arrived early to help out, as she always did. It was comforting to have her best friend nearby on such an important day. Helen, everything looks beautiful. You really outdid yourself, Lisa said, admiring the decoration. Richard is going to be moved. I hope so, Helen replied, adjusting the final details. I want him to know how much these 10 years mean to me. In the mid-afternoon, Richard finally appeared in the party area. He looked around, impressed. Wow, Helen, it really looks incredible, he said, but Helen noticed that the smile didn't reach his eyes. Do you really like it? She asked, looking for genuine approval. Of course. It's perfect, like everything you do, Richard replied, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek before going to get ready. The guests started arriving at 7 in the evening. College friends, work colleagues, family members, neighbors. Helen felt radiant, receiving congratulations and hugs from dear people who came to celebrate with them. It was exactly how she had imagined it would be. Richard was charming, greeting everyone warmly, telling stories and laughing at friends' jokes. For a few moments, Helen completely forgot about the worries of the past few days. This was the Richard she knew and loved, sociable, affectionate, present. Around 8:30, Helen noticed Richard talking to a man she didn't know. He was tall, handsome, well-dressed, and seemed a few years younger than Richard. The two were laughing about something, and there was a closeness between them that caught Helen's attention. She approached, curious. Helen, I want you to meet Stephen, a work colleague, Richard said when she got close. Stephen, the name from yesterday's message. Helen felt her stomach tie in knots. Nice to meet you, Helen. Richard talks about you a lot, Stephen said, extending his hand with a smile that seemed genuine. The pleasure is mine, Helen replied, observing the interaction between the two. There was something there that she couldn't identify, a familiarity, an intimacy that seemed to go beyond a simple work relationship. Stephen just moved to the city. I'm helping him get settled, Richard explained. That's nice. Where did you come from? Helen asked, trying to be polite despite her growing discomfort. While Stephen answered something about Chicago, Helen observed how Richard looked at him. There was special attention there, an interest that went beyond professional. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Helen knew Richard too well not to notice. The conversation was interrupted when Lisa appeared, reminding Helen that it was time for the toast. The moment she had been looking forward to most all night had arrived. Richard picked up a glass and asked for everyone's attention. The room fell silent, with all eyes on him. Helen felt her heart race with emotion. Friends, family, dear people. Richard began, his voice clear and firm. Thank you for being here with us on this special night. 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to marry the most incredible woman in the world. Helen smiled, feeling tears coming to her eyes. Helen is everything a man could dream of in a wife. She is dedicated, caring, a wonderful mother to our Amanda, and the person who made my life complete. Richard continued. The words were beautiful, even perfect. But there was something in his tone of voice that bothered Helen. It seemed like a rehearsed speech, words that came from his mouth but not from his heart. She looked at Richard while he spoke, and for the first time, she felt like he was performing. These 10 years have been the best of my life, Richard concluded, raising his glass. To Helen, to our family, and to the next 10 years to come. Everyone toasted, applauded, and Helen received congratulatory hugs and kisses. But inside, something was wrong. The speech had been too perfect, too formal. It didn't sound like the spontaneous Richard she knew. During the rest of the party, Helen couldn't stop watching Richard and Stephen. They sought each other out in the crowd, exchanged glances, talked in more private corners. When he thought no one was looking, Richard touched Stephen's arm in a way that made Helen feel uncomfortable. It was like watching a dance she didn't understand, but knew shouldn't be happening. When the party was ending and guests began to leave, Helen saw Stephen saying goodbye to Richard. The handshake lasted longer than normal, and Helen could swear she saw Stephen squeeze Richard's hand in a special way before leaving. Later, while they cleaned up the last traces of the party, Richard was unusually quiet. "The party was a success, don't you think?" Helen asked, looking for a connection with her husband. "It was. You did an incredible job," he replied, but he was already putting things away, avoiding looking into her eyes. Helen stood in the party area, now empty and silent. It had been exactly as she had dreamed. Perfect decoration, delicious food, dear friends, a moving speech. But why did she feel like something important had been lost in the middle of all that perfection? And why couldn't she stop thinking about the way Richard looked at Stephen? Have you ever had the feeling that something important was happening right in front of you, but you couldn't understand what? Comment below if you've ever been through a situation like that. On the Monday following the party, Helen woke up with a strange feeling in her chest. The party had been a success. Everyone praised it. The photos turned out beautiful, but something continued to bother her. It was like having a stone in your shoe that you feel but can't remove. Richard had already left for work when she woke up. Once again, Helen looked at the clock. It was only 7 in the morning. When did Richard start leaving so early? She tried to remember, but couldn't identify exactly when this became routine. After taking Amanda to school, Helen returned home and paced around the living room, restless. She couldn't stop thinking about the party, specifically about the interaction between Richard and Stephen. The more she thought about it, the more details came back to her memory. The way Stephen knew the house, as if he had been there before. The way he knew where the bathroom was without asking. How Richard and he seemed to have inside jokes, references that only they understood. Small things that, alone, meant nothing. But together, Helen shook her head. She was being ridiculous. Richard had the right to have friends at work. She was being paranoid, exactly as he said. But then why couldn't she stop thinking about it? The phone rang. It was Lisa. "So, how are you feeling after the party?" "You must be exhausted," Lisa said. "I'm fine, just... I don't know, Lisa. Can I ask you a strange question?" "Of course. Go ahead." Helen hesitated. It was difficult to put into words something she herself didn't quite understand. "Did you notice anything strange at the party, between Richard and that guy, Stephen?" Lisa took a while to respond. "Strange how?" "I don't know. They seemed very... close. For people who only know each other from work." "Helen, are you okay? You seem worried." "It's just... Lisa, for a few weeks Richard has been different. More distant, goes out more, comes home later. And yesterday, seeing him with Stephen, I had a feeling..." "What kind of feeling?" Helen took a deep breath. It was the first time she was saying this out loud. "A feeling that I don't know everything about my husband. And that scares me." Lisa was silent for a moment. "Helen, you've been married for 10 years. It's normal for people to change, to have different phases. Maybe Richard is just going through a period of more work, more stress." "Maybe," Helen agreed, but wasn't convinced. After the conversation with Lisa, Helen tried to occupy herself with household tasks, but her mind kept going back to the past few weeks. When was the last time Richard came home at normal hours? When was the last time they had a real conversation about things that mattered? She went to Richard's home office. It wasn't a place she usually touched. She had always respected his workspace. But today, something pulled her there. The desk was organized as always. Work papers, project plans, some architecture books, nothing out of the ordinary. Helen felt silly for being there, looking for... what exactly? She was about to leave when she noticed an agenda half hidden under some papers. It wasn't Richard's professional agenda, which she knew. It was a personal agenda, small, that she had never seen before. Helen looked at the door, making sure she was alone, and opened the agenda. The notes were simple: times, names, places. But there were many markings for S at strange hours. Lunches, Meetings after work, even some weekends. S could only be Stephen. Helen felt her heart race. Why did Richard need a separate agenda for appointments with a work colleague? Why didn't he write them in his regular agenda? She flipped back a few pages. The notes with S started about 3 months ago, exactly when Richard started becoming more distant. Helen quickly closed the agenda and put it back in place. Her hands were shaking. She was invading her husband's privacy, something she never imagined she would do. But she also never imagined she would have reasons to do so. The rest of the day passed slowly. Helen tried to concentrate on normal tasks, but her mind wouldn't stop. When Richard came home that night, later than usual, of course, she watched him with different eyes. "How was your day?" she asked, as she always did. "Normal, meetings, projects, you know how it is," he replied, as he always replied. But now, Helen knew it wasn't just that. She knew there were meetings he didn't mention, schedules that didn't add up, a parallel life she was unaware of. And Stephen? How is he adapting to the city? Richard paused for a second longer than would be natural. "Fine, I think. Why do you ask?" "Curiosity. He seemed nice at the party." "Yeah, he's a good guy," Richard said, already changing the subject. "Did Amanda do her homework?" The change of subject was too abrupt. Helen had known Richard for 15 years. She knew when he was uncomfortable with a topic. That night, lying in bed next to her husband, Helen looked at his profile in the dim light. The same face she had been kissing for 10 years, the same hands that held hers at the altar. But there was something different now, a distance that didn't exist before. For the first time in 10 years of marriage, Helen realized that maybe she didn't know Richard as well as she thought. And this realization was both frightening and liberating. Frightening because it meant her reality might not be what she believed it was. Liberating because, for the first time, she was really paying attention, not just seeing what she wanted to see. Helen had always been the type of person who trusted completely, who believed that love was enough, that honesty was natural in a marriage. But what if she was wrong? What if some people were capable of living double lives with an ease she couldn't even imagine? The question that wouldn't leave her head was, if Richard was hiding something as simple as meetings with a work friend, what else could he be hiding? Helen never imagined she would become the type of wife who investigates her husband. But she also never imagined she would feel like a stranger in her own life. In the 2 weeks following the party, she began to pay attention to things that had previously gone unnoticed. Richard left home at 7 in the morning, but Helen discovered that his office only opened at 8:30. Where did he go during that hour and a half? He said he stopped to have coffee and organize his day. But Helen knew all the cafes on the route to his work. It was a route she herself had taken hundreds of times. On Tuesday, Helen decided to do a test. She pretended that Amanda was sick and called Richard's office around 10 in the morning. "Sorry to bother you, but I need to talk to Richard about our daughter," she told the secretary. "Helen, Richard hasn't arrived yet today. He has an external meeting in the morning," the secretary replied. External meeting. Richard hadn't mentioned any external meeting at breakfast. "Oh, of course. Do you know where the meeting is?" "In case it's urgent," Helen asked, trying to sound casual. "I don't have that information. Sorry. Do you want to leave a message?" Helen hung up, feeling her heart race. It wasn't proof of anything. She knew. Richard could have forgotten to mention the meeting. But why was this becoming a pattern? That night, when Richard came home, Helen tested again. "How was your meeting this morning?" Richard paused, clearly surprised by the question. "A meeting?" "Yes, I called your office and the secretary said you were in an external meeting." "Oh, yes, it was. It was about that new project I told you about," he said. But Helen noticed he avoided looking into her eyes. "Who was the meeting with?" "Helen, why so many questions? It sounds like an interrogation." It was the second time Richard made her feel like she was being inappropriate for asking normal questions about his day. Helen decided not to insist, but the feeling that something was wrong only grew. On Friday, Helen did something she never thought she would do. When Richard left for A late afternoon meeting. She decided to follow him. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure everyone on the street could hear it. She felt ridiculous, even pathetic. But there was something inside her that needed to know. Richard didn't go to the office. Instead, he drove to a neighborhood Helen knew well. It was where several restaurants and bars they used to frequent when they were younger were located. He stopped in front of a small, cozy cafe. Helen parked a few blocks behind and walked until she could see inside the cafe. Her stomach dropped when she saw Richard sitting at a corner table, chatting animatedly with Stephen. It wasn't a formal work meeting. The two were relaxed, laughing, and there was an intimacy in their posture that made Helen feel like she was invading something private. Stephen touched Richard's hand on the table, and Richard didn't pull away. Helen hid behind a post, watching the scene through the cafe window. They seemed happy, comfortable with each other in a way she hadn't seen Richard in months. She stayed there for almost an hour, watching the two of them talk. When they finally got up from the table, Stephen gave Richard a hug that lasted longer than would be normal between work colleagues. Helen ran to the car and got home before Richard. When he arrived, an hour later, she was in the kitchen preparing dinner, trying to act normally. "How was your meeting?" she asked, testing again. "Productive," Richard replied, but didn't give details. "Who was it with?" "Potential clients, nothing very interesting." Lie. Helen knew it was a lie because she had seen it with her own eyes. Richard had looked into her eyes and deliberately lied. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She lay looking at the ceiling, trying to process what she had seen. Richard and Stephen clearly had a close friendship, closer than Richard was admitting. But why hide this? Why lie about meetings with a friend? Unless it wasn't just a friendship. The thought came out of nowhere, and Helen tried to push it away immediately. It was ridiculous. Richard wasn't. He had never shown. They had a normal sex life. They had a daughter together. They had been married for 10 years. But then, why was he lying? Helen began to pay attention to other details. Richard had recently changed his cologne. He was taking better care of his appearance, going to the gym more frequently. His hair was always impeccable, his clothes more elegant than usual. And there were the text messages on his phone. Richard had always been relaxed with his phone, sometimes even asked Helen to answer when he was busy. But lately he kept the device always close, answered messages in other rooms, and when Helen approached while he was typing, he would quickly close the screen. One night, when Richard was in the shower, Helen saw his phone on the dresser. Without thinking much, she picked up the device. It was password protected. Richard had never used a password on his phone before. Helen typed Amanda's birth date. Access denied. She tried their wedding date. Access denied. She tried her own birth date. Access denied. Her heart was racing. Richard had changed the password and hadn't told her. Why? When Richard came out of the shower and saw Helen near the dresser, he asked, "Were you going through my phone?" "I was just—" "No, sorry. It rang, and I thought it might be important," Helen lied. Richard took the phone and put it in his bedside table drawer. It was a small gesture, but it spoke louder than any words. Helen went to bed that night knowing that her life was changing irreversibly. Every small discovery, every detected lie, every strange behavior was building a picture that she still didn't want to completely accept. But the picture was becoming clearer and clearer, and Helen knew that soon she would no longer be able to ignore what was right in front of her eyes. The question was she prepared for the truth she was about to discover? Have you ever had to choose between living a comfortable lie or facing a painful truth? Tell us in the comments how that experience was for you. Helen was at her limit. 3 weeks of suspicions, detected lies, and disturbing discoveries were taking their toll. She could barely sleep, ate little, and Amanda had already asked twice if Mommy was sick. On Wednesday morning, after another sleepless night, Helen called Lisa. "I need to talk to you. Urgent," she said, her voice revealing the desperation she was trying to hide. Lisa arrived at Helen's house an hour later, carrying coffee and donuts, the classic combination for difficult conversations since college days. "Helen, you look terrible. What's happening?" Helen took a deep breath. It was the first time she was going to tell someone everything. "Lisa, I think Richard is cheating on me." Lisa almost dropped her coffee. "What?" "Helen, where did you get that from?" "Let me tell you everything," Helen said, and began to describe the past few weeks. The strange schedules, the lies about meetings, the secret agenda, the evasive behavior, and finally, the encounter she witnessed between Richard and Stephen. Lisa listened to everything in silence, her expression gradually changing from surprise to concern. "Helen, I know this must be difficult, but it might not be what you're thinking. Men can have close friendships without it meaning—" "Lisa," Helen interrupted her, "let me show you something." Helen picked up Richard's agenda, which she had borrowed from his home office. "Look at this," she said, showing the pages to Lisa. 3 months of meetings marked as S, at times that don't match what he tells me. Lunches, dinners, weekend meetings, and he lies about where he is. Lisa examined the agenda, frowning. "This is really strange," she admitted. "But Helen, even if he's hiding a friendship, it doesn't necessarily mean it's an affair." "Then why lie? Why hide it?" "Lisa, yesterday I tested again. I called his office at a time when he said he would be there, and the secretary said he had left for a personal meeting." "Personal meeting, Lisa. He's never used that expression before." Lisa was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to confront him directly, but part of me is afraid of the answer." "Helen, you've been married for 10 years. You have the right to know the truth." That afternoon, Helen decided to follow Richard once more. She felt bad doing it, but she needed more certainty before destroying her marriage with accusations. Richard left the office at 5:30, as usual lately. But instead of going home, he drove to a residential neighborhood that Helen didn't know well. He stopped in front of a small apartment in a discreet building. Helen parked at the corner and watched. Her heart almost stopped when she saw Richard use a key to enter the apartment. He had a key. He wasn't visiting. He had his own access to that place. 20 minutes later, Stephen arrived. Helen recognized him immediately. Stephen also used a key to enter the same apartment. Helen stayed there for 2 hours, watching the building. The apartment lights were on, but she couldn't see what was happening inside. Her imagination, however, was running wild. When Richard finally left the building, it was already 8 o'clock at night. Stephen left 5 minutes later. They said goodbye with a long hug on the sidewalk before each going to their car. Helen got home before Richard, as she always did after these investigations. When he arrived, she was in the kitchen with Amanda, helping with math homework. "Hi, family," Richard said, kissing the top of Amanda's head and giving Helen a quick kiss on the cheek. "Sorry I'm late. Meeting ran long." "Who was the meeting with?" Helen asked, her voice controlled despite the inner storm. "New clients. Big project, but kind of complicated," Richard replied without hesitation. Helen nodded, but inside she was screaming. He was lying in front of their daughter with no apparent embarrassment. That night, after Amanda went to sleep, Helen locked herself in the bathroom and cried for the first time in weeks. They weren't just tears of sadness, but of anger, confusion, and an overwhelming feeling that her entire life was a lie. When she came out of the bathroom, Richard was in bed, looking at his phone. He was smiling at the screen in a way Helen hadn't seen in months, a genuine, happy smile. "Important message?" Helen asked, trying to sound uninterested. Richard quickly closed his phone. "Just work," he said, but the smile remained on his face for a few seconds. Helen lay down next to her husband, feeling like she was sleeping next to a stranger. 10 years of marriage, and she was discovering that she didn't know the man she shared a bed with. What scared her most wasn't just the possibility of betrayal. It was the ease with which Richard lied, the naturalness with which he built a parallel life, the coldness with which he could look into her eyes and make up stories. If he was capable of this, what else might he be capable of? Helen looked at the ceiling, knowing that another sleepless night awaited her. but also knowing that she was reaching the end of her ability to live in ignorance. Soon she would have to make a choice: continue pretending she didn't know anything, or confront Richard and discover the whole truth, no matter how painful it might be. And deep in her heart, she already knew which choice she would have to make. The question was whether she was prepared for the consequences of that decision. Because one thing Helen was sure of: once certain truths are revealed, there's no going back, and she was very close to discovering something that would change her life forever. The following days were the most difficult of Helen's life. She walked through her own house like an actress playing the role of a happy wife, but inside she was crumbling. Every smile for Richard was forced. Every "How was your day?" came out of her mouth like ground glass. Helen had always been a direct person who solved problems head-on. But this time, she couldn't. It was as if she were paralyzed between knowing too much and not knowing enough. She had evidence that Richard was lying, but didn't have the courage to find out exactly about what. What if it was worse than a simple affair? What if it was better? What if she was going crazy over nothing? On Friday morning, Helen was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard laughter coming from the living room. Richard and Amanda were on the couch, watching cartoons together before she went to school. It was a scene that had always warmed Helen's heart, but now it only increased her anguish. Richard was being the father he had always been: affectionate, present, playful. He made a silly face that made Amanda giggle, and Helen felt like she was watching everything through glass. How can someone be so normal in one part of life and so deceitful in another? "Mommy, did you see what Daddy did?" Amanda ran to the kitchen, still laughing. "Yes, I did, sweetheart." Helen smiled, but felt that the smile didn't reach her eyes. When Richard got up to get his car keys, another morning leaving early to organize his day, Helen almost asked where he was really going. Almost, but the words got stuck in her throat. "See you later," Richard said, giving her a kiss on the cheek, as he had done every day for 10 years. "See you," Helen replied, watching him leave. After dropping Amanda off at school, Helen came home and felt lost. She couldn't concentrate on anything. She tried to clean the house, but abandoned it halfway. She tried to read a book, but the words didn't make sense. She tried to watch TV, but her mind wouldn't stop wandering. Lisa called around noon. "How are you?" "Terrible," Helen answered honestly. "Lisa, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending everything is normal when I know it isn't." "Then stop pretending. Confront him." "What if I'm wrong? What if this is all my paranoia?" "What if you're right? Helen, you have the right to know the truth." I know I do, but I'm afraid of the answer." "Afraid of what?" Helen was quiet for a moment. "Afraid that my entire life is a lie. Afraid of discovering that the person I love most in the world has been deceiving me for years. Afraid of having to rebuild everything from scratch." "Helen, you are strong. Stronger than you imagine." "I don't know if I am." "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm drowning." In the afternoon, Helen was at the supermarket when she saw Richard on the other side of the aisle. Her first instinct was to hide behind a pile of cereal boxes. She watched her husband choosing wines, expensive wines, the kind they only bought on special occasions. Richard hated going to the supermarket. He always left those tasks to Helen. What was he doing there, buying expensive wine in the middle of a Friday afternoon? Helen discreetly followed him to the checkout. He bought the wine, flowers, red roses, Helen's favorites, ironically, and imported chocolate. It was as if he were buying things for a romantic date. But the date wasn't with her. When Richard passed by the checkout line where Helen was, he didn't see her. He was distracted, checking messages on his phone with that smile she hadn't seen in months. Helen paid for her groceries on autopilot and ran to the car. She sat in the driver's seat and let the tears fall freely for the first time in days. They weren't just tears of sadness, but of anger. Anger at Richard for lying. Anger at herself for allowing it. Anger at the whole situation. How did they get to this point? When did everything start going wrong? And why was she the last to know? That night, during dinner, Helen watched Richard interacting with Amanda. He asked about school, helped with homework, told silly jokes that made the girl laugh. It was impossible to reconcile this affectionate and present Richard with the man she had seen buying gifts for someone else a few hours before. "Daddy, can we go to the park this weekend?" Amanda asked. Helen saw Richard hesitate for a split second. "Of course, Princess. How about Saturday morning? And in the afternoon, too?" "Saturday afternoon, Daddy has some commitments, but Sunday we can spend the whole day together." Commitments. Helen knew what kind of commitments. After Amanda went to sleep, Helen and Richard were alone in the living room. It was the first time in weeks they were really alone, without the daily rush. Helen looked at her husband, who was on his phone as always. "Richard," she began, her voice coming out more shaky than she would have liked. He replied, without looking up from the screen. Are you happy? With our life? With our marriage?" Richard finally looked at her, surprised by the question. "Of course I am. Why do you ask? It's just, I don't know. You seem distant lately. I feel like something has changed between us." Richard moved closer to her on the couch and held her hand. "Helen, I love you. You know that, right? You and Amanda are the most important thing in my life." The words were beautiful, but Helen couldn't ignore that he didn't answer the question directly. And there was something in his eyes, not exactly guilt, but discomfort. "I love you too," Helen replied automatically, but the words sounded empty even to herself. That night, lying in bed next to Richard, Helen made a decision. She couldn't live in that agony anymore, in that no-man's land between suspicion and certainty. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. On Monday, she would confront Richard. She would show the evidence, ask the right questions, and finally discover what was happening in her marriage. Because living in doubt was killing her inside, and Helen knew she deserved more than that. She deserved honesty, she deserved respect, and she deserved the truth. Even if that truth destroyed the life she knew. Have you ever had to make a decision that you knew would change your life forever? Tell us in the comments how it was to find the courage to take that step. Monday arrived like a weight on Helen's chest. She woke up determined, but with trembling hands. During the weekend, she had mentally rehearsed the conversation dozens of times. She knew exactly what she was going to say, how she was going to present the evidence, how she was going to give Richard a chance to explain everything before drawing conclusions. Richard left early as always, and Helen spent the day organizing the evidence she had collected. The agenda with meetings marked as SS, notes about the lies she had detected, even some photos she had discreetly taken of the apartment where she saw them meeting. When Amanda came back from school, Helen left her at her grandmother's house. "Mommy needs to have an important conversation with Daddy," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is everything okay?" Amanda asked, her green eyes, so similar to her father's, full of concern. "Yes, sweetheart, it's just adult talk." At 7 o'clock at night, Helen was in the living room, waiting. She had placed all the papers on the coffee table, organized like evidence in a courtroom. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Richard arrived at 8:15, later than he said he would arrive, of course. "Hi, honey," he said, kissing her forehead, as always. "Where's Amanda?" "At my mother's house," Helen replied, her voice sounding more controlled than she expected. "Why?" "Because I need to talk to you." "Sit here, please." Richard looked at her curiously, but sat on the couch next to Helen. "Richard," she began, taking a deep breath. "A few weeks ago, I started to notice that you were different, more distant, going out more, coming home later." "Helen, we've already talked about this. It's work. You know how it is." "Let me finish," Helen said firmly. "At first, I thought it was my paranoia. But then I started really paying attention." Helen picked up the agenda and showed it to Richard. "This is your agenda, the one you hide in the office. 3 months of meetings marked as S, at times that don't match what you tell me." Richard looked at the agenda, and Helen saw his face pale slightly. "Helen, I can explain." "I'm not finished yet," she interrupted him. "I called your office several times when you said you would be there. You never were. Your secretary talked about external meetings that you never mentioned. Look, this isn't… Richard, I followed you. The words came out like a shot. Richard became completely still. I followed you to that cafe where you met Stephen. I saw you talking, laughing. I saw him touch your hand. I saw you hug each other in a way that's not normal between work colleagues. Helen. And then I followed you to an apartment. An apartment where you have a key, Richard. Stephen also has a key. You stayed there for 2 hours. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. And when you came home that night, you looked into my eyes and lied. You said you had been in a work meeting. You lied in front of our daughter. Helen picked up the photos she had taken of the building. This is the apartment, Richard. Do you want to explain to me why you have a key to a place I never knew existed? Why do you meet Stephen there in secret? Why do you lie to me every day? Richard was looking at his own hands, unable to face Helen. I don't. And on Friday, I saw you at the supermarket buying expensive wine, flowers, chocolate. It wasn't for me, was it? It was for him. The silence that followed was the longest of Helen's life. Richard seemed to be fighting an internal battle, trying to find words that wouldn't come. Richard, Helen said more softly, for 10 years I have trusted you completely. I never questioned, never doubted, never went after you. But now I'm giving you the chance to tell me the truth, the whole truth. Richard finally looked up at her. Helen, who is Stephen to you? More silence. Richard, who is Stephen? He is. Richard swallowed hard. He is what? He is my boyfriend. The words came out as a whisper, but hit Helen like a punch to the stomach. The air left her lungs all at once. Your boyfriend? Richard nodded, unable to speak. Richard, are you telling me that… Helen, I'm gay. The world stopped. Helen felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of life together, 10 years of plans and dreams and… You're gay, she repeated, the words sounding strange in her own voice. I always have been, always have been. Helen stood up from the couch, feeling dizzy. You always knew you were gay? Yes. And you married me anyway? Yes. Helen looked at Richard as if she were seeing him for the first time. The man she had slept in the same bed with for 10 years, the father of her daughter, the man who promised to love, honor, and respect until death do them part. Why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why did you do this to me? Richard was there, now that he had been discovered. Helen, I thought I could… No, Helen interrupted him. Don't give me excuses. You knew exactly what you were doing when you married me. You used me. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, Helen exploded. You used me as a facade. You built a fake life using my feelings, my love, my trust. Helen, please, let me explain. But Helen couldn't listen to anything else. The man she loved, whom she trusted more than anyone in the world, had lied to her about the most fundamental thing of all, who he really was. 10 years of her life, 10 years of true love, wasted on a lie. Helen looked at Richard one last time that night. He was there, silent, no longer denying anything. But nothing he could say could fix what had happened. I need time, she said, picking up her car keys. I need to get out of here. Helen left home that night knowing that her life had just changed forever, and that, as painful as it was, she finally knew the truth, a truth that destroyed everything she had always believed about love, marriage, and trust. Helen drove aimlessly for more than an hour. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, and several times she had to pull the car over because she couldn't see properly through her tears. Finally, she stopped in an empty parking lot near downtown and turned off the engine. Total silence. It was the first time in weeks that Helen was completely alone with her thoughts, and reality began to hit with full force. Richard was gay. He had always been gay, and he married her anyway. Helen rested her head on the steering wheel and let the tears fall freely. It wasn't just sadness. It was anger, humiliation, a feeling of being completely deceived about her own life. After an hour in the parking lot, Helen went back home. She needed answers. She needed to understand how this was possible, how she had been so blind, how 10 years of her life had been built on top of a lie. When she arrived, Richard was in the living room, in the same place where she had left him. He looked at her when she entered, but said nothing. "I came back because I need to understand," Helen said, sitting in the chair across from him. Not on the couch next to him. She couldn't be close. "I need you to explain to me how this was possible." Richard nodded. "How long?" she asked. "What? How long have you known you're gay?" Richard hesitated. "I've always known, Helen, since I was a teenager. So when you asked me to date you in college, you already knew?" "Yes. When you proposed to me, you knew." "Yes. On our wedding day, when you looked into my eyes and promised to love me forever, you knew it was a lie." Richard didn't answer, but the silence was answer enough. Helen felt like she was falling into an endless pit. Each yes from Richard destroyed another piece of the memories she considered precious. "Why?" she asked, her voice coming out as a whisper. "Why did you do this?" "Helen, you have to understand. At the time, it was different. My family, society. Being gay wasn't accepted like it is today. So you decided to use an innocent person as a shield. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that." Helen stood up, anger taking over. "You used me, Richard. You used my love, my trust, my entire life to hide who you really were." "Helen, I genuinely tried." "No," she interrupted him. "Don't give me that. You didn't try anything. You made a conscious choice to build a fake life using another person. You knew I was truly in love with you, and you used that against me." Richard remained quiet. "All these years, Richard, all these years I wondered if I was good enough, if I was pretty enough, why you were so distant sometimes. I thought the problem was me." Helen began walking around the room, memories flooding back like a torrent. "Our honeymoon. You barely touched me. I thought it was newlywed nerves. Our intimate life was always strange. I always felt like you were somewhere else, but I thought it was all in my head." "Helen." "Amanda," Helen said suddenly. "Was Amanda planned, or was she an accident you had to accept?" Richard took a while to answer. "She was planned. I knew we would have to have children to keep up appearances." The coldness of the response hit Helen like a slap. Amanda, her beloved daughter, had been conceived not out of love, but as part of an act. "You made me believe we had the perfect marriage," Helen said, her voice beginning to fail. "All our friends envied our relationship. I was proud of our family, of the life we built together, and it was all a lie." "Not everything was a lie, Helen. I have affection for you. I always have." "Affection?" Helen turned to him, incredulous. "Affection? Richard, I loved you with every fiber of my being for 10 years. I would have given my life for you. And you felt affection. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did hurt me. You stole 10 years of my life. 10 years I could have spent with someone who really loved me, who desired me, who was honest with me." Helen sat down again, feeling exhausted. "And Stephen? How long have you been together?" 6 months. "Where did you meet?" "At the gym." Helen remembered Richard starting to exercise more, taking better care of his appearance. "Were you planning to leave me?" Richard hesitated. I didn't know how to do that." "So you were going to continue deceiving me indefinitely. You were going to continue living this double life, making a fool of me, while you had your real life with Stephen." "Helen, it's more complicated than that." "No, it's not," she shouted. "It's quite simple, actually. You're a coward who preferred to destroy another person's life rather than face your own truth." Helen looked around the room. The family photos on the wall, the wedding anniversary gifts, the memories of a life she discovered was false. "All these photos," she said, "all these happy moments I kept in my heart. When you hugged me in these photos, what were you thinking? About how you wanted to be somewhere else?" Helen, stop this. I won't stop. You owe me this, Richard. After 10 years of lies, you owe me the complete truth. Helen got up and went to the shelf where the photo albums were. This one here, she said, picking up a photo from the wedding. Do you remember this moment? I had just thrown the bouquet. I was laughing, happy. Look how you're looking at me in this photo. It looks like true love. Was it all theater? Richard didn't respond. Helen looked at the photo and then at the man she thought she knew. 10 years later, she was finally seeing Richard for what he really was. Not the dream husband she had imagined, but a stranger who had used her life as a convenient fantasy. I need you to leave the house tonight, she said calmly. I can't look at you right now. Helen, we need to talk about Amanda, about how we're going to— Not tonight. Today, I discovered that my entire life was a lie. I need to process this before making any decisions. Richard got up and headed toward the bedroom. I'll get some things and stay at a hotel. When he left the house 20 minutes later, Helen was alone for the first time in 10 years. And for the first time in a long time, the silence of the house didn't bother her. It was a relief not to have to pretend anymore that everything was okay. Have you ever discovered that someone very close to you wasn't who you thought they were? How was it to deal with the feeling that your most precious memories were based on lies? Tell us in the comments. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Helen was sitting in Dr. Martinez's office, her therapist, reflecting on the journey she had traveled since discovering the truth about Richard. The first days after the revelation were the most difficult of her life. Helen could barely get out of bed, had no appetite, and cried for hours on end. Lisa practically moved into her house to take care of her and Amanda, who still didn't know anything about what was happening between her parents. I felt like I had died inside, Helen told the therapist, like my entire identity had been based on a lie. But as the weeks passed, something interesting began to happen. Between the pain and anger, Helen began to rediscover who she was beyond being Richard's wife. You know what's strange, Dr. Martinez? For years, I wondered why I sometimes felt inadequate in my own marriage, why I felt like something was missing, even when everything seemed perfect on the surface. And now you understand why, the therapist asked. Exactly. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough. It was because it was impossible to have a real connection with someone who was pretending to be someone else. Helen remembered the first weeks after Richard left home. Amanda asked thousands of questions about why Daddy wasn't sleeping at home, and Helen had to find a way to explain without destroying the image the girl had of her father. Daddy and Mommy are going through a difficult phase, she said. Sometimes adults need time to work things out. It was Lisa who suggested therapy, and it was the best decision Helen had ever made. In the sessions, she began to understand that carrying guilt for the marriage's failure was unfair to herself. I spent weeks wondering what I had done wrong, Helen told the therapist. Wondering if I should have noticed earlier, if I was stupid for not seeing the signs. And what do you think about that now? Now I understand that I trusted, because that's what normal people do in healthy relationships. I wasn't stupid. I was honest, and he took advantage of that honesty. The divorce process was surprisingly civilized. Richard didn't contest anything, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of relief at finally being able to live openly. Helen kept the house, primary custody of Amanda, and a fair financial agreement. During one of their weekly lunches, Helen told Lisa, "You know what was most liberating? It was realizing that I don't have to pretend everything is okay when it's not anymore. For years I maintained this facade of a perfect marriage, even when something inside me knew it wasn't. And now I can be honest, with Amanda, with myself, with everyone. It's scary sometimes, but it's real." Helen resumed hobbies she had abandoned during marriage. She went back to painting, something she loved doing in college, but Richard always considered a waste of time. She started taking dance classes, something she had always wanted to try. She even enrolled in a photography course. In a therapy session, Helen said, "I was talking to Amanda yesterday, and she told me, 'Mommy, you seem happier now.' And you know what's incredible? She's right. How do you feel about that? At first, I felt guilty. How can I be happier after my marriage ended? But then I understood. I'm not happy because my marriage ended. I'm happy because the lie ended. Helen still had difficult days, moments when anger returned, or when she felt lonely, or when she wondered if she would be able to trust someone again. But there were also days when she felt freer than ever. One thing I learned, Helen said, is that I'm stronger than I imagined. For years I defined myself as Richard's wife. Now I'm discovering who Helen is alone, and she's quite interesting. Richard still saw Amanda regularly. He moved to the apartment where he met with Stephen, and now lived openly the relationship he had hidden for so long. Helen sometimes felt anger, seeing how he seemed free and happy while she was still dealing with the wreckage of the lie. But she also felt relief at not having to live with the falseness anymore. Amanda asked the other day if I'm going to get married again, Helen told Lisa. And what did you answer? That I don't know. That maybe one day I'll find someone who truly loves me for who I really am, but that there's no rush. Helen was learning to enjoy her own company. She discovered that she could be happy alone, that she didn't need a man to complete herself. It was a lesson she never imagined she would need to learn, but that proved invaluable. You know what I realized? Helen said in her last therapy session. I spent 10 years trying to be the perfect wife for a man who was never going to be able to love me the way I deserved. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because he wasn't capable of it. And now I know I deserve true love. I deserve honesty. I deserve someone who chooses to be with me not as a facade, but because they really want to build a life with me. Helen left the office that afternoon with a feeling of lightness she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't that her life was perfect. She still had a lot of healing work ahead. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. She looked at the blue sky and smiled. It was a genuine smile, not forced like so many she had given during years of fake marriage. It was the smile of a woman who had faced her worst truth and discovered she was capable of surviving it. Helen was ready to write a new chapter of her life. This time, it would be a chapter based on truth, honesty, and the self-love she had rediscovered. And for the first time in 10 years, the future seemed full of real possibilities. Helen's story teaches us one of life's most powerful lessons. Sometimes the greatest betrayals lead to the greatest transformations. Helen lost a fake marriage, but found herself. She lost a life based on lies, but gained a life based on truth. She discovered that being deceived for 10 years didn't make her a victim forever. It made her a stronger and wiser survivor. The moral of this story is profound. You are never responsible for the lies others tell about themselves, but you are always responsible for how you choose to rebuild your life after discovering the truth. Helen could have sunk into bitterness, anger, self-pity. Instead, she chose to heal, grow, and transform. How many times in life do we accept crumbs of love when we deserve the complete feast? How many times do we prefer to live a comfortable lie instead of facing a liberating truth? Helen shows us that it's possible to start over at 40, that it's possible to discover who you really are after years of living as someone else wanted you to be. True happiness doesn't come from relationships that appear perfect, but from authentic connections based on truth. Helen learned that it's better to be alone being true than together living a charade. Now I want to know from you, what lies are you accepting in your life out of fear of facing the truth? What relationship or situation in your life needs more honesty? How can Helen's story inspire you to have more courage to seek authenticity? Leave your reflection in the comments. Your experience can inspire other people who are going through similar situations. If this story touched your heart, leave a like on the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to receive more transformative stories like this. Until the next exciting story.